Hello and welcome to the Society for the Environment's latest webinar and the second in a 5-part series with the umbrella topic of natural capital in your business. This is now our 7th series of expert-led cross-disciplinary webinars. The series looks into the theory of natural capital, how it should be implemented, examples of good practice and insights into how it can benefit both the environment and business. Following last week's introductory webinar to natural capital, today's webinar will see us start to explore the approach in a little more detail. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in the coming days via our website, YouTube channel, and if you've opted in to receive emails from us, you will receive an email with the recording link. And for those of you watching the webinar as a recording, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time using the contact details on your screen. As a way of introduction to ourselves, very quickly, you are watching a Society for the Environment webinar. We hold the 2 professional registers for environmental professionals, the Chartered Environmentalists or CM register and the Registered Environmental Technician or RM Tech register. In order to become a CM, you will need to be a member of and apply via one of these 24 professional bodies. You can also become an RM Tech via 3 of these bodies, which are now highlighted. I shall leave these logos on the screen for just a moment. If you want to find out more, please visit socenv.org.uk or inquire with the relevant professional body directly. They can point you in the right direction, provide guidance, and many can arrange a mentor. That's quite enough for me for now. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by 2 expert Chartered Environmentalist speakers. Our first speaker is Angus Middleton, MSc CM. Angus is a Chartered Environmentalist registered via IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and is Director at Viridian Logic. Welcome, Angus, and thank you for joining us today. Angus will explore nature-based solutions and how they involve enhancing natural systems to solve society's problems. Angus will discuss various challenges involved with designing nature-based solutions and how these can possibly be resolved. Angus, for the next 15 minutes or so, it's over to you.
Right. Hi, thanks, Sarah, for the introduction. As you said, my name is Angus Middleton, and I'm a director at Viridian Logic. We are a small consultancy that specialize in modeling and mapping of natural capital, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, and that sort of thing. We specialize, I guess, in water-related flows, so around flooding, nitrates, phosphates, erosion, siltation, but we also add in sort of full natural capital baselines and carbon and pollination, soil quality and other things as well. So that's kind of why I'm here talking today. But I thought to start with, I'd give a little bit of an introduction about what nature-based solutions really are. So the 3 terms that are bandied around a lot are natural capital, nature-based solutions, and ecosystem services, and they're often interchanged. But they do have sort of slightly different nuances there. So the natural capital is the stuff, the rivers, the trees, the soil, that then supply the ecosystem services. So those are the good things that flow from the natural capital, from that stuff, such as reduced flooding or better air quality, or carbon sequestration. And nature-based solutions kind of fits into both of those because it is about enhancing the stuff or creating new stuff, new natural capital, so that the benefits, the ecosystem services that flow from it then solve specific problems for society, such as the flooding or the bad air quality. So it is very much the solutions to our problems, and usually to specific problems. And the real power of them, I think, is that a single intervention, a single solution can solve many problems all at the same time. The list on the right here on this slide is just a sort of a mixture of useful resources for people who want to find out more. And the ones I think are specifically relevant to the UK context is ENCA, the Enabling a Natural Capital Approach from the government, which is sort of a guide to how to do it. The Natural Capital Protocol from the Capitals Coalition. They have lots of good resources and guides and information and tools there. And then the Ecosystem Knowledge Network and the Green Infrastructure Partnership, again, they are sort of networks. They have lots of resources, lots of information, links, and ways to find out more. So those are all well worth a look. So nature-based solutions, how do we actually go about it? Well, I think the most important sort of first step is to work out how we're going to approach it in a particular area. We're trying to solve specific problems using nature, using natural capital. So how do we work out what should we do and where should we do it? And here there are two main ways of doing this. The first is sort of shown by the dice at the top there. It's very much taking a chance. So do anything wherever the opportunities come up without any real planning or modeling to suggest the best places to do it. So if a landowner offers his streams to create leaky dams in, or offers some field margins to plant hedges or buffer strips, whatever it is, just take that opportunity and do the stuff there. That sort of attitude is that the more you do, doesn't matter where it is, the more these benefits will stack up and accrue. And doing the modeling, doing lots of planning is just a waste of money. It's much better to spend it all on the actual interventions themselves, the getting stuff planted or created on the ground. I would tend to suggest that maybe isn't the best approach in all circumstances. It has its place, certainly. But a lot of that money, I think, will be wasted, because if the right interventions are not placed in the right places, then they will have very little benefit, and all of the money spent on creating them will be wasted. So that's the bottom two images here, is really about how to decide what to do where. And again, this can be divided into two theoretical camps. The first is where the benefits are felt at the same location that the features are created or the habitats are planted. So the left image here is about carbon sequestration. Where you put the trees or create the wetland, that is where the carbon is stored. Those individual pieces of nature, those individual, that vegetation actually stores the carbon on that location. And just simple GIS or map overlays is very good for understanding that, because they happen in the same place. The other form is around flows. So where water is involved, really, it's the water flows through the landscape, and where you put the interventions, where you plant the trees or create that wetland, is often not where the benefit is felt, because the flooding happens far downstream in a completely different part of the landscape. So you plant trees or create these features in one part of the landscape to stop the problems in another one. And to do that properly, you really have to understand the connections between them, how that water flows through the landscape already, and how that landscape is acting to make those flows worse or better. And that is really exemplified by these images here. So on the right is the working with natural processes, sort of woodland layer. And working with natural processes is a great resource. Lots of information, lots of research and guides there. And also some mapping around the country. And this map on the right, the darker green and the brown, is saying these are okay places to plant woods, to woodland, to stop flooding from the rivers at the bottom of the catchment. But the way it's modeled, the way it's put together, really means that these green and brown areas are just places where it is not bad to plant trees. There's no particular reason not to plant the trees there, such as it being a road or a house or an SSSI for stuff that isn't woodland. So, but it's not really saying those are the best places to do it, because as you can see, it covers the majority of that catchment area. The majority of the landscape on the right there is covered with this dark green stuff. So a lot of those areas actually won't give any flood benefit whatsoever. You might create a lovely woodland, but you'd get no reduction in flooding from the rivers. The image on the left is a prioritization mapping, very different. So it really is saying which are the best places to do stuff to stop flooding in the same catchment. And you can see they're very different. And the one on the left, the blue, means actually water retention features. So things like leaky dams, leaky bunds, swales, those sorts of ideas. And the darker the blue on that image, the more effective doing things in that place will be. And the paler blue is less effective. And I think all of the blue areas in that left image amount to the best 20% of all options in that catchment for reducing flooding. So you can see these are very different types of modelling and types of map. And unless you're using the right one for what you're trying to achieve, you can go quite far wrong. So it really is important to actually use the right type of targeting for whatever your project is trying to achieve. And that kind of feeds into this idea of trade-offs as well. So it's fine for just a single objective like that. We're just looking at natural flood management, reduce flooding. But if we start to think about wider issues, it becomes more complicated. And that's what this slide is showing us, how complicated things can get. If we try to think of all of the things that nature-based solutions can do at the same time, and all of the problems they might create as well, this can cause real trouble. So as a sort of a simple example, if you're looking to reduce flooding, you might plant trees all over loads of arable land. At least that's what the modelling might tell you to do, and that would reduce income from that arable land. And so there would be a trade-off there. You might reduce flooding, but then you wouldn't get any crops from the arable land, and people's incomes will go down, and it's probably not going to happen. It's just not going to be viable. There are other trade-offs as well, which I've come across lately, and some of this was around groundwater as well. So we were looking to stop sewer flooding using nature-based solutions. And the water company had sealed a sewer recently, but that had knock-on effects because the groundwater was no longer getting into the sewer and being pumped away. So when it was sealed, lots of basements and commercial premises around it, the underground areas, flooded, tunnels and stuff as well. So they're interested to reduce the groundwater level to stop ingress into the sewers without flooding other people. So we looked into that, and we could do that. But the problem was, would we exacerbate flooding elsewhere? So if with water stored up in a higher catchment, it might stop it running down into this area of target area, but it might actually flow down into other areas, overland or through the ground, and exacerbate problems elsewhere. So we had to look into that. And the other problem we had was, would it stop water getting to an abstraction well? So reduce public drinking water assets. So these are kind of trade-offs to start thinking about. But there are also multiple benefits, because by creating these features up in the top of the catchment, actually we were beginning to stop siltation happening in some of the streams, and stopping diffuse nitrates and phosphates getting there, or capturing carbon, and actually improving some of the biodiversity habitat connectivity. So there were lots of benefits there, but we had to make sure there were no trade-offs as well. So that can get quite complex. And that brings us into the idea of valuation, because we can begin to think of lots of objectives and trade-offs, but which ones are the most important? And valuation can be done in all sorts of ways. Some of it can be related back to, is it worth doing this? So to think about that modelling thing again, in the do-no modelling, do-no planning approach, which was done in Swindon a few years ago, then all the money goes to the actions you're doing on the ground. Whereas I know the National Trust were involved in some natural flood management work over in the southwest, and there almost £500,000, I think it was spent on modelling to try and work out what the benefits would be to doing these interventions and where to do them, which seems a bit excessive. That, is probably not worth it. You'd have to really value the outcomes very, very highly. So if we're thinking about valuations, some things are easier to value than others, such as carbon sequestration. You know how much carbon a tree can store, or you can estimate it very simply. There are lots of ways out there to put financial metrics onto carbon sequestration by trees. But perhaps other things are much harder to value, such as the mental health given by natural capital, or the visual amenity, the landscape characteristics that might be improved, and habitat connectivity and things. So this slide is a bit of an idea of showing actually it's possible in different ways to think about the value of everything, because if you miss some of it out, if it's not valued at all, it might get overlooked and given a nil value, so that actually those services which might be very important are just not considered, and so the wrong good things might be put in the wrong places, or the wrong things put in because there's these certain aspects, because they couldn't be valued, they weren't considered as part of the mix. But it is possible, I think, to do that through some things just being simple RAG rating. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it good? Is it bad? All the way through to detailed financial valuation and everything in between. And I think we can compare between these things. It's not exactly like for like, but it's possible to wrap it all in and get that idea of valued benefits in there. So this is a slide I have to show you just because of all of the data we suck in to create those images. So while you're looking at this mighty interesting stuff, there's beyond the value of benefit, it is proving it works, and this is really difficult. There has been some monitoring of projects. There has been some real life analysis of what works and what doesn't, but not enough, I don't think. We can value stuff qualitatively really quite well, I think. Will it make a difference? Is it better or is it worse? And we can bring lots of things together. But that proof is very difficult because nature-based solutions work on a very different way to the old engineering ideas that people like the Environment Agency still require to a large extent to release funds. So it depends on who you're having to prove things to get the agreement to make these nature-based solutions, and about what proof you need to put in there. We can create volumes of water stored. We can start to look at synchronizing flow peaks, but there's a lot more to it than that. There's nature-based solutions work on many levels, whether it's slowing flows, whether it's capturing pollutants, whether it's reducing air temperature in the local area. And it works within the soil, on the land surface, and up into the air as well, all around. So then these things interact, so it can be very complex. So it is possible in different stages, and it depends on how much is required will dictate how much modelling is put in, because the more detail, the more precision, to get those answers always costs more. So I would suggest it's always worth doing the minimum at each stage to get to the next stage, to get those stakeholders on board, to get the funders on board, and to release funding and projects so they can happen. And this guide, and that sort of the idea of co-creation is very important here as well. There's a term called ecological imperialism that came up a while back, where the people who were trying to do this rewilding and nature-based project were just using their own agendas, and they were telling landowners what they needed to do. They were not consulting with them, so the project fell apart. Whereas if they'd gone in and consulted with those landowners in the first place, actually the project would have been very successful and probably had better outcomes all around, even if it had been sort of allowed to go ahead in the first place. So local knowledge, local aspirations, local desires are very important to get in there. Makes everything better and makes it quicker, less expensive, and less likely to fail. So thank you very much for listening. Please do drop me a line if you have any questions. Very happy to look at any projects you have to see how they might be improved with nature-based solutions or the natural capital thinking. And I'm very happy just to help wherever I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. I thought that was a really fascinating insight into the important topic of nature-based solutions, so thanks again. Now let me introduce our second expert speaker, Stuart Wilson, CM. Stuart is a Chartered Environmentalist registered via SAEEM, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, and is environment team leader and principal advisor at Highways England. So a huge welcome to Stuart. Are you with us?
Thank you, Sarah and Angus for that very in-depth technical and interesting discussion. So I'm here to provide just a quick introduction to the work that Highways England has been doing with Natural England to build natural capital into decision making. So it's a different level to the detail that Angus has been doing, which is detail around mapping and actually the technical information to support decision making. This is actually about taking input from others and making sure that decisions take account of that information. So what we're trying to do is support the development and delivery of better outcomes from infrastructure projects by having taking account of natural capital. More simply, what we've seen is we've seen about 15, 20 years of theory around natural capital, and what we want to do is move from that theory to general use. So and this is not necessarily just solely about mapping data sets, stock services, flows, but is actually about the way that that can practically influence decision making. So what I'll cover is I'll cover briefly transport appraisal. So this is the system that we currently use for making decisions around infrastructure investment projects. I'll link appraisal and assessment, so that's environmental appraisal and environmental assessment, so that we can see that there is information that comes in from different threads of development of projects. I'll go quickly through what natural capital assessment is all about, why we have drivers for a natural capital approach and what they are, why we need natural capital approaches. So it's not solely about the detail and the scientific knowledge, but it is actually about informing investment decisions. Where we've got to in terms of current practice and where we see a wide range of variable approaches, the key steps within that approach, what it does, and the next steps. So transport appraisal, for those that don't know it, used to be called WebTag, is now TAG, and is essentially the Department for Transport's guidance and toolkit. It's made up of a series of different software tools and guidance notes around transport modelling and appraisal techniques. What we mean by all of this is it's the collection of information that we need to effectively make a decision or an investment decision. What all of that boils down to is it takes lots of technical information from other sources and it summarizes that back in something called the Appraisal Summary Table, or AST. It's a single summary document which looks like this. The intention there is that you have various different aspects and considerations that are brought together into a single business case that a decision can be made on. So what we've got is distillation of lots of different information and detail to a single page. So the purpose there is to provide decision makers with a concise across the board overview, and it is meant to balance economic, environmental, social and public accounts. And the outcome is an appraisal and development of transport interventions that build evidence to support the business case development, and it provides an overall summary for a need for a project, costs, benefits and disbenefits. So natural capital or any other concept has to sit within this framework of decision making or supplement or complement. We also have environmental assessment. So appraisal, as I said, is environmental information for inclusion in transport appraisal, based on baseline information taken from environmental assessment work, and it provides a quantitative summary for noise, air quality, greenhouse gases, and a qualitative summary for landscape, townscape, historic environment, biodiversity, and water environment. So the points that Angus has made, there are data sets that will be presented in a quantitative manner, so physical units, numbers, and then those that are described in terms of broad scales of change. Environmental assessment does a similar thing. It provides environmental information for reporting in an environmental assessment report or environmental statement. So this is the consenting framework within which we work. And it's a process by which information from environmental effects is collected, assessed, and used to inform decision making. And here we have a qualitative summary in most cases with some quantitative data behind them, which talks about or informs the decision or conclusion around likely significant effects. So what you've got is you've currently got two processes which do align quite well. There's direct alignment of topics between appraisal and assessment, and occasionally there are a few that collate into one particular subject or not. But in contrast, natural capital assessment, according to the Green Book, is the measurement of the stocks of the elements of nature that we provide value. The things like forests, fisheries, rivers, biodiversity, land and minerals, which we've been assessing and appraising through the two previous methods, and it includes living and non-living aspects of the ecosystem. So what we've previously done is we've looked effectively at resources and the changes that a project is going to impose on those resources, potential for benefits to derive from that, but also a particular focus on disbenefits, which is where significant effects usually come from. And natural assets do, however, generate useful products and services for people. Environmental assessment and appraisal don't actually specifically take account of those elements. And natural capital assessment provides the link between economics and the traditional environmental work that we'd undertake. So, and the stocks of natural capital are taken account of. We have changes in goods and services, both market and non-market. So these are things that have a financial value or non-financial value that provide a benefit to society. So it's a different focus rather than just looking for constraints mapping and resource change. You're actually looking at a change in the services that are derived from those resources effectively. So there are a number of policy drivers out there for natural capital approach. Everything that we do in terms of investment decisions at Harvest England is governed by something called HM Treasury's Green Book, and it's got a number of useful aspects within it that are identified in terms of natural capital assessment. It says that understanding natural capital provides an improvement for improved appraisal. So the intention here is that we don't just look at whether or not we're impacting or changing resources, but actually that we take account of the flows that come from those resources or the services. Natural capital stock levels should be systematically measured and monitored so that we can understand and control them. Their use should not be seen as being free or ignored. It should be taken into account in decision making. And then we've got more recently the enabling natural capital approach by DEFRA. And within this, it does start drawing together the theory. It points towards scientific, economic and social evidence and analysis, so drawing all of those together in a common framework, so not appraisal, not environmental assessment, but a common language or framework for all of those aspects to talk to each other. It reduces the risk of the value of nature being ignored in decision making. I'd go the opposite, that it actually strengthens the value of nature. If you can quantify, describe and explain to others the value of the resources that are being impacted or could be benefited by a project, then they can more clearly be described and considered within decision making. It enables a more comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. So straight back to economic investment language. If we understand what is changing, we understand the costs of doing interventions or the costs of loss or the benefits of maintaining services or maintaining stocks, then that helps us to understand that an investment is worthwhile or not. And it facilitates a more innovative approach to identifying policy solutions. So what this means is that you can actually look at a piece of land and you can decide that that piece of land doesn't just need you to go and maintain the landscape, but actually you might choose to maintain the landscape to benefit water sequestration, carbon sequestration, water quality, water quantity, flood attenuation. You might be intending to derive a different objective from that land than purely providing a landscape screening benefit or a visual interest. It recognises the spatial variation of environmental issues, and it helps to identify priorities for investment. We're now a company. We have natural capital assets, and our bottom line is absolutely dependent upon the assets that we hold. However, natural capital assets are not a strong focus of where we are focusing our investment effort. And that's the reason why we have a particular driver in that direction. And it provides a basis for systematic accounting, so we can do the profit and loss from natural capital over time. We can say that if we do not maintain or improve our assets, that we have degradation of our bottom line. So why a natural capital approach? The reasoning behind this is that we need to influence decision making. Investment, the interventions that we make, the decisions that we take, all of those are down to decision makers. They need information on the relative performance of, in our focus, options before we get to the point of projects. Projects themselves, and then design elements. So these are small elements of schemes. And if we had that, it allows us to optimize or get the best outcomes from what we're doing. We need to strengthen business cases. So I'm an environmentalist. I come from an ecology environmental impact assessment background, but I absolutely understand that everything that we do requires investment and requires us to strengthen business cases. So if we can provide information on benefits and costs that are representative partially or in a qualitative manner, that still helps people to understand and take account of environment within decision making. Natural capital also supports efficiency, so we can guide where design changes are likely to contribute to the greatest degree of improvement, so where projects or project options, or indeed the choice between a bridge or a viaduct gives us the greatest degree of improvement in stocks or services, and which elements of design in particular deliver really well for stocks and services and need to be protected. So we can make sure that we keep the bits that we want within projects and that we improve the elements that are performing suboptimally. In terms of supporting projects, what it can also do is help to develop evidence for case of the scheme. So essentially, the story around natural capital is not well captured or reflected within consent applications at the moment. And actually, there's a much wider story than just the focus or the objective of that individual project in terms of what it can do. And that can do is the elements that Angus was talking about. It can sequester noise, it can attenuate carbon, it can improve water quality. All of these elements can be described much better if you understand natural capital. And it can support people. So one of the key elements of natural capital, whilst it may be complicated in its theory, in terms of what it presents at the end of the day, it can describe to people the benefits that they get from existing stocks, rather than simply saying something is of value. So it's effectively turning language, technical, environmental assessment or appraisal language, into something that the audience can readily understand. That supports decisions or understanding of trade-offs between different stocks or services, and where people in society can see that things are improving, they can consider whether or not at the same time they want to take account of a deterioration in the availability of food provision because there's a loss of agricultural land. So in terms of current practice, quite a lot of the focus of what we've seen, not through this series, but actually in terms of practice ourselves, is that there is an evaluation of stocks and services of projects. That's not the options. That is a project that is physically known, its boundary is known, and the area of that project is understood. That's not necessarily at the best stage. So we report outcomes, but we don't optimize performance. So we quantify, we do units of measurement, we might do pounds, but we talk about what a project has delivered. What we didn't do was optimize the best that particular project could have delivered. We see proprietary approaches, and there are repeatability issues in there. We have absence of influence on decision making because in this case, that's reporting, not informing. So it's information that's paralleled to the consent application or reported afterwards, but it doesn't actually inform the decisions that are being taken as closely as it could do. We also have focus on what is lost rather than identifying suppressed services or identifying opportunities. So Angus was showing mapping, which identifies opportunities, but actually too often it's easier to talk about what physically is lost under the footprint of projects rather than what could be improved or the opportunities that could be taken. We see scoping evaluation is based on ease to monetize. Quite often we chase pounds in service change through an approach which is called materiality assessment. So later stages of natural capital assessment, you'll see something called materiality assessment used, and it's effectively a means of scoping or limiting the things that you're going to quantify in detail. And we see lots of data collection, but not enough use. So you can produce large volumes of information, but actually directly using that, making sure that you understand the rules and the way that decision makers can take account of that is the focus of what we can do. In terms of work to develop a natural capital approach, we've been working, DEFRA's enabling a natural capital approach sets out a range of methods and tools available for assessing natural capital and appraising ecosystem services. And HIWAS England have been developing an approach which focuses on the biodiversity metric 2.0, which provides quantified units of change. Natural England's ecometric, which is a pre-release approach, and that measures the changes in average score per hectare. So it starts to quantify things. And then Natural Capital Coalition's Natural Capital Protocol, which has been referred to previously, which you get a pound sterling change in certain services where those are available, or in other cases, quantified units of change. And we're using the relationship between natural capital stocks based on habitats and the changes in average provision of ecosystem services as a voluntary decision support tool. So essentially, we have a means of turning the stocks and service provision or change into something that can inform decision making. Around the key steps within this approach, we'll be putting it into something called the Appraisal Manual, piloting a natural capital approach, and it will include 3 principal steps. The first is biodiversity net gain assessment, and that's during the early stages of scheme development. So during the option stages where we have multiple corridors and we could choose to put a road scheme anywhere from sort of 10 kilometres apart. The reason why we've got that is because it is actually a prerequisite. Natural England, when they launched the ecometric, will make net gain a prerequisite of any project using the ecometric. And it adopts an approach which is Biodiversity Metric 2.0, something that Highways England is doing in any case, and it provides us a common way of measuring the change that projects will impose and making sure that we support net gain. So the next key step is ecosystem services appraisal. And this again is used in the early stages of scheme development when we have those corridors again. And it uses Natural England's ecometric as a calculator. So the ecometric provides the information, the means of actually sucking in information and then putting out an indication of change. And the technical annex which we've developed builds on this. It's the approach, the method, which takes the information that's provided by the calculator and extends it and explains it so that decision makers can take account of it. And then finally, we'll revert to natural capital assessment, normal natural capital assessment, which is where you get a detailed assessment based on a single project or site. And the results of ecosystem services appraisal will be used to scope the key areas for more detailed consideration. So where I refer to materiality assessment, our ecosystem services appraisal will tell us the services that we will look at and evaluate in terms of trying to find out the pound sterling change and or the units of measurement change. And then we will do the natural capital assessment process undertaken following using the natural capital protocol. So in terms of what our approach does, the option stages, we have examination of potential impacts on 18 categories of ecosystem service flows, and that supplements reporting of appraisal and assessment topics. So it doesn't get rid of environmental assessment or environmental appraisal, but it provides another strand of information for the decision maker. It utilizes online and consistent data sources, aerial photographs and site survey, and provides information to decision makers on relative performance of options, so for each ecosystem service. So essentially what we're looking at is a direction and magnitude of change for each service, and in the performance category, we take account of the general direction of change of those service provisions, so that the decision maker doesn't get a complex of information, but actually gets an understanding of the broad direction of travel that different options have compared to each other. So we've got a category or scale which goes from better performing options through neutral performance to worse performing options. So what we have is at the top end of the scale, you have options that are to be protected and or have some degree of optimization left in them. And at the bottom end of the scale, a significant improvement that needs to be made in terms of realizing the potential for delivery of better service provision with the project. So it helps to understand where projects are on that scale. We then have preliminary design, where we have a single project, more what other people would understand as a project. We have one route, one design option, and this supports targeted optimization of design. So what that means is we can identify on that single project where service provision is optimized, and in other areas where it needs to be improved. So we have identification of elements of the project where there are potential decreases in ecosystem services which we can improve, and other areas where ecosystem services are optimized, and we can protect that in any subsequent design changes that we go on. So later in the life cycle, this is moving through the consent and delivery process. We have ecosystem services appraisal influencing the scope of full natural capital assessment, in place and materiality assessment, so a direct replacement for that. And we have assessment in line with the Natural Capital Coalition's protocol. So in terms of what we need to do next, we've got further development of our methodology. We want to do to ensure that there's proportionality and performance categorization and hierarchy. So the reason for that is proportionality is at the options phase is we have multiple options to look at and compare, and collecting data on all of those and repeating it to other people, to the decision maker, it needs to be undertaken in a proportionate manner. In terms of the performance categorization and hierarchy, the intention behind that is that it informs decision makers. They can see the difference between an optimized option and a less well-performing option, and they can choose between those with an understanding that some of those will need a lot more work in terms of optimization of service provision. We've also got a case study underway, which looks at parts of the application of our approach, and we hope to get reporting back on that fairly shortly. And we then need to move towards identifying and agreeing pilots. So what we're going to do is identify a range of net gain projects and take them through all stages of project development using this approach, so that we can see whether or not we have better environmental outcomes, or whether or not there are unintended outcomes from that. When you start to accumulate and summarize information, there's always a danger or risk that it will identify inappropriate conclusions or recommendations. So we need to take this approach through piloting. And then the technical annex will be published shortly, and we'll move from the position of having theory agreed with Natural England and ourselves towards actually having live projects that have run through this approach and can describe better to decision makers the influence or change that they're going to make in terms of stocks and services and the conclusions that they should draw from that. So we have a supplementary method that builds on environmental assessment and environmental appraisal that looks specifically at aggregating the overall performance in terms of service provision of our projects, and we'll be able to provide that to decision makers so they can decide whether or not there's investment that takes account of opportunities that can be realized, or whether or not there are aspects that need to be improved within some of the options or projects that we're taking forward. Thank you for your time today, and I'll pass back to Sarah now.
Thank you, Stuart. Some really great insight there, and I know I've learned a lot myself during these two talks, so it's really great. Thank you both. For everyone watching, it's now Q&A time. If you haven't already, now's the time to ask a question or two using the Q&A function within your toolbars. We will do our best to get through as many as we can before 1 p.m. So if I just turn to some questions we've already received. So if I start with a question for you, Angus, this is quite a general question, I guess, but a question here: how much evidence is required to provide sufficient confidence in nature-based solutions?
It's a good question. It depends on who it's for. It's very case specific. As I was saying in the talk, some people need a lot of evidence and a lot of information to sort of cost benefit and stuff, especially people like the Environment Agency who want to be able to link it in with their engineered solutions and have specific ways they have to go about releasing finances. Excuse me. And then other people need very little evidence at all. Some of the wildlife trusts and rivers trusts, sometimes their funding is pinned on the fact that they have to show that they've considered ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, and that they are looking at doing good things or the best things, but they don't have to quantify it in any way. So there doesn't have to be so much evidence behind that, and they're really looking at improving habitat. So I always think the best way to approach this is to work out what's required and do the sort of the minimum amount, spend the minimum amount to do that, to actually fulfill that, making sure it's the client's objectives are met for what you're trying to implement these nature-based solutions for, and then all the evidence and proof is there to release the funding or to show that it's worked, depending on sort of the secondary reasons for doing the project, or the funders, whatever it is. So yeah, it's best done case by case.
Okay, thank you for that. A question for Stuart. Got a question here that says, would this system have been used to provide the decision-making data in appraising the case for HS2?
So I think I can duck that one, Sarah. HS2 is a DFT project, but is outside of the Highways England area of responsibility, and I'm not aware of the policy or appraisal mechanism that they used.
Okay, fair enough. Another question I have for you, Stuart. Sometimes the greatest improvements will take the longest time. How can we evaluate different interventions all trying to achieve the same goal? Discounting. I think you touched on this a little bit, but I don't know if you have any further comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the answer, currently the approach that we've got has 3 timescales associated with any of the changes in service provision. The one that we're particularly focused on is the 30-year, which is the longest period that we have, because we recognise the point that most of the interventions that we're looking at will derive a benefit at much longer timescales. So we're adopting 30 years, and we'll be working with Natural England to extend that further. In terms of where we are at present, appraisal typically looks at a 60-year appraisal period, and so we would be looking to try and move that 30-year period to 60 years for consistency. The other approach to look at as well is that in the biodiversity metric approach, there's currently a series of discounts that take account of exactly the point that's been raised, which is the years to target condition. And currently we would evaluate that through the biodiversity net gain assessment, but we would not then take that on to the natural capital assessment or ecosystem services assessment. So it's something for development in the future.
Yeah, makes sense. A question for Angus. What is the biggest challenge to widespread implementation of nature-based solutions, and how can it be resolved?
Yeah, another tricky question. I think partly it is proving it works and being able to quantify the benefits or show the benefits in a way that decision makers understand and can fit in with typical project development, funding and accounting processes. And that's one that's going to take a little time to do. We're working on various ways of doing that, but there are trade-offs on this sort of thing. It is not always easy to fit what we're doing now into current processes. So if we can influence thinking, very much as Stuart's doing there, to change the way things are done and thought about, then the adoption will be much greater and more widespread, I think. So it's a bit of both of us changing as an industry of how we present information on what we're doing, and then trying to change the way the sort of the mainstream funders and accountants and program managers think about the nature-based solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question for Stuart here. When is Highways England's natural capital appraisal coming forward for obligatory use on all schemes?
Yeah, good question. So what I presented was an approach, a technical annex, which provides for piloting. We're at the stage of effectively checking that we don't get perverse outcomes from the approach, and Natural England are particularly keen that we pilot the approach, prove the concept, and then release it after that. So the technical annex is due for release this financial year. We'll then move towards piloting after that, and then sometime I would expect next financial year we'll move towards use on a range of schemes. Those schemes it will be used on is already determined to some degree. It won't be total use on all schemes because we need to ensure that the approach is proportionate, but there's a sort of targeted approach to using it on some of our larger schemes, and then moving towards more general use in the business after that. So this financial year for the technical annex, and then next financial year for piloting and or moving towards use on schemes.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. And maybe a question for both of you actually is, there's a question here that says, how can I use natural capital to help reach our net zero goals? I assume as an organisation there. Is there a link between the two concepts? Maybe
Yes.
who wants to go first on that one?
Well, I think Angus presented a slide that showed the use of carbon sequestration on it, and absolutely within the sort of ecosystem services appraisal that we're using, one of the key elements that is looked at and in natural capital assessment subsequently is the degree of carbon sequestration that is offered by the reinstatement that can happen after a project. However, that's not really the real goal of where we should be. What we should be doing is looking at the potential, the current sequestration in systems that are already in place before a scheme is introduced to them, and that we take account of making sure that we optimize the place in which we put our schemes so that we open up potential for further sequestration and don't suppress already good sequestration.
Yeah, and I'll sort of jump in there and say, yes, it is. Is this change that's important? So taking a baseline and then working out what the change will be is important, because otherwise you could cut down a forest and plant a forest. I'm not going to get very, very far in reality. But it's also, I think, it is this multiple benefit. So yes, absolutely, it feeds into net zero. Once, of course, you've tried to minimize emissions and minimize impact. This kind of offsetting thing, but it's maximizing those multiple benefits. So what are the right habitats to create to sequester carbon, but also to give all these other benefits? If it's in cities, to improve air quality, to reduce temperature, to improve visual and health amenities. If it's rural, to reduce flooding, to reduce diffuse pollution getting into streams, to improve soil quality, to connect habitats up, to create these stepping stones that join existing habitats. So there's putting things in the right place. Not only gives lots of benefits around it, but it can also make it a lot less expensive, a lot cheaper for a company to do that, because they can sell these co-benefits. So it's not just them paying for the whole thing. It could be lots of other people chipping in for these other benefits for that same intervention.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. Some really good answers there, I think. Another question here, how do I do an identification and assessment and mapping of ecosystem services in a protected area? I don't know if Stuart, you have any thoughts on that one?
I think, Rabi, that's a very good question, particularly in a UK context. Natural capital assessment and ecosystem services in the approach that we've taken generally does not have provision for protected areas. Protected areas are a separate consideration. So in terms of consenting, I said that environmental assessment and appraisal has to be separate, and we still need to make sure that we have statutory alignment or appropriate response. And actually, ecosystem service appraisal is not ever going to replace the protection that is afforded to those areas. I think that the biodiversity metric assessment will enable those areas to be assessed in terms of, are they currently in optimal condition and improved, but that's not the focus for me of an ecosystem services assessment. You could, however, look at an existing area, and in the same way that you treat any other area, as long as you're not trying to replace the protection afforded to that area, you can look at the services that it derives, that we derive from that area, and map those in the same way that you would do for any other land. So it's perfectly possible. It's no different, but it does not replace the statutory protection afforded to that area, and whether or not you can actually provide replacement and compensatory measures and actually take account of that area in the first place.
Yeah, and I'll just add there that it's something we put into our modelling all the time is protected areas or priority species and habitats. Because it just says what you can and can't do in those areas, and also maybe who you have to do it with, whether it's the national park or the wildlife trust, or there are other people who will need to be involved should you want to do stuff in those areas. But it's actually quite simple to work out the best places to do stuff in those areas, whether it's improving habitats or creating new ones that actually sort of help those protected areas as well as deliver all these benefits. So yes, it's perfectly possible to do.
Thanks both. Probably got time for maybe one or two more questions, so I'll be quickly on that. So we've got one here that says, what would be the best database or databases for UK habitat types that could show the carbon sequestration potentials for different land management decisions? Is there confidence in these underlying databases? Angus, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's various ones. The Forestry Commission has some quite good stuff. There are, I think DEFRA had some from a few years ago, and there is a Natural England research papers that, again, from a few years ago, that had the changes in management, land management, and the carbon implications of doing that. Having a single database. I think the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code are very handy, but to have a single database that tells you what every habitat does and all the changes in every location, it doesn't exist as far as I know, because of all the nuances and differences in different parts of the country, and there's a lot of considerations. So it's worth looking around, seeing what's out there locally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the main improvements that we need in natural capital assessment is actually to have consistency of and confidence in the quality of the data that we use to undertake the assessments. And to some degree, that's the reason why we've taken the approach of adopting the ecometric, which is data owned by Natural England, who have actually gone through that quality assurance process themselves and have confirmed that they believe that it's appropriate for the use that it's being put to. I do think that UK PLC can take an approach of trying to get a consistent set of data that we can all use, that we have a range of understood pound values and or sequestration rates, but the reference sources that Angus has already pointed towards tend to be the typical sources that most people refer to. Brilliant.
Thank you both. I think we're pretty much at 1 o'clock, so I think I'll end there. But thank you both so much for spending time with us today and providing some really useful insight, I think, which I hope has provided some ideas on how to embed natural capital thinking in your work. So before you all disappear, I just have some further opportunities you might be interested in. So as mentioned at the start of the webinar, this is the second webinar in a 5-part natural capital webinar series. We therefore have 3 more webinars coming up. Part 3 looks at the roles of farmers, land managers and consultants. Following that, we delve into woodland creation and embedding natural capital into strategy in part 4. And then to conclude the series, we hear from a member of the Natural Capital Committee who explores the application of natural capital approaches. Free registration is still available for all of these webinars via the website address on your screen now. It's important to point out, if you missed the first webinar in this series, don't worry, you can access the recording for free by visiting the website address on the screen now. If you're interested to hear more about the CM or RM Tech registers, please also take a look at our How to Become and Why Become recorded webinars on our website. You'll also find all the recordings from our last webinar series, which was on the topic of biodiversity. This webinar will be on the YouTube channel and our website very shortly as well. And lastly, the Chartered Environmentalists CM community has recently been telling the world about their vital work and why they do it. If you're inspiring to become a CM or an environmental professional more widely, this is a place for some serious insight and inspiration from across sectors, disciplines and continents. If you are a CM, there's still time to get involved. Search for IMCM hashtag on Twitter, LinkedIn and YouTube. You'll find inspiring video clips, interviews, webinars, wise words of advice and more. And that's it from us today. Thank you for listening and taking part. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to gain notifications of new videos and tap on the thumbs up button. That would be great. It all helps to spread the word. Many thanks again to Angus and Stuart for the excellent content, and I will see you in the next Natural Capital webinar, which is next week. Thank you for watching and stay safe.